So now we're going to start diving a little deeper into these Java structured concurrency mechanisms. And we're going to begin with our discussion on the Java TaskPerThreadExecutor. And we're going to talk about TaskPerThreadExecutor, and I'm going to show you a little bit about how to program with it. So this feature, the TaskThreadPerTaskExecutor, adds two new factory methods to something called the JavaExecutors utility class. That's what these two methods are. And we're also going to see that it adds another extension to the ExecutorService interface, which has been around for a long time, and it adds this ability to auto-close executor services so they can be used in a try with resources block. So here's one method, new thread per task executor. That's a factory method that's part of the executors class that when called will return a new thread for each task that's needed. Traditionally, the executor service has been used to create pools of threads, pools of platform threads or traditional Java threads, rather than creating a thread for each one. There was a way to create a thread for each one, but that was uncommon. So this new thread per task executor factory method will start a new thread for each task, and you can control what kind of thread it is by this thread factory. So you can decide whether to make it a virtual thread or a platform thread. There's also another method which is more explicit in its intent, and it's called new virtual thread per task executor. And as you might imagine from the name, it makes a new virtual thread every time it's called. And that's really what we're going to be focusing on because that's the interesting one. These executors, just like the structured task scope example we looked at before, are used within the Java try with resources feature in this block. So you say try open paren var executor equals executors dot new virtual thread per task executor, which is a bit of a mouthful. So that'll make you a new virtual thread per task executor. And what that does is it'll create a new thread every time you call its submit method. So just to show how this works, let's go ahead and iterate for 10 million times. And each time we iterate, we're going to call submit on the executor, which will go ahead and create a new virtual thread. And in this particular case, that virtual thread will run this sleep call to sleep for a second. So we'll have 10 million threads all sleeping for a second, which should take about a second to run, give or take. Probably take a little bit longer than a second, but in the range of a second. Won't take 10 million seconds, that's for sure. And all these submitted virtual threads must complete by the end of the enclosing scope. So by the time we leave this try with resources block, all the threads will be done, and all the computations will be finished, and also the executor value here will be cleaned up because its close method will be auto-called. This mechanism is very simple, but it's also limited. There's certain things you just can't do with it because it's so simple. You can't support fine-grained exception handling. There are no invoke any semantics. We'll talk about what invoke any means in a second. It lacks automatic task cancellation, and so on and so forth. So there's a bunch of things you can't do with this mechanism. One thing you can do with this mechanism that's pretty cool, however, and we're going to use this throughout all the programming assignments and the examples we'll look at henceforth with Spring, is you can use it as a drop-in replacement for common executor service use cases. So for example, if you start looking at the new assignments that are coming out of the examples we're going to be talking about in class that use Spring, you're going to see that in the application files, there'll be this bean annotation, which basically says, Spring, please use the executor's new virtual thread per task executor mechanism to create a new virtual thread for each incoming client request, as opposed to doing what traditionally was done with Spring, which was to pool threads in a thread pool. So you can very easily and transparently configure in these new capabilities by using beans and the executor's new virtual thread per task executor mechanism. So that's kind of cool. However, in general, the limitations that we talk about with the executor's executor service variant of structured concurrency motivate the need for this newer Java structured task scope mechanism, which we're going to spend most of our time talking about. And that's what you're going to get experience programming in this class when we get a little bit further along. So that's the end of a quick overview of Java TaskPerThreadExecutor. I'll show you some other cool examples of using it, but just be aware that with the exception of the Spring runtime threading plugin, this is not widely promoted anymore as the way to do structured concurrency in Java, although it exists.